You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of April 2025 on Monocle Radio.
China looms menacingly at Taiwan again. Which companies will dare be the first to reopen in Russia? And big-budget Beatles impersonators unveiled. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel, Hilton and Quentin will discuss today's big stories, and we'll check in with Monocle's team at Watches and Wonders in Geneva. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and regular Monocle Radio contributor Quentin. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Greetings.
Isabel, first of all, you have been gallivanting around the continent like some sort of crazed Europhile, visiting Berlin and Brussels. What were you up to
Got
in those
me
places?
in one, Andrew.
Yeah.
No. Speaking as a crazed Europhile. Well, I was looking at what's happening in Europe with Germany's fantastic handbrake turn on spending, lifting the debt brake and so on, and what that will mean for defence and Europe's climate policy, bearing in mind the rise of the far right in the European Parliament and across Europe. And those are people who are both opposed to green policies and some of them opposed to the European Union itself. So it's a very interesting moment.
And some of that is germane to today's discussion. We will be coming back to a couple of those points. Quentin, meanwhile, you have been mourning a colleague, much as Monocle Radio, and I would think Monocle Radio's listeners have been mourning a fairly regular voice on our airwaves.
Yes, dear Gwen Robinson, who was an utterly wonderful journalist who was at the FT with Nikkei, and indeed, I think, a regular contributor to you. She was in Bangkok, and that's where she died the day after the earthquake in Myanmar, probably the country she loved more than any other. And it was a sort of curiously tragic end. She'd been wrestling with cancer for a long time, but she was just a real journalist. She was one of us to the core. She was funny. She was in your face. She was, for a long time, she was the comment editor at the FT, and she used to have to deal with all the great and good. And the way she told them that they'd overwritten or they needed to be edited was wonderful to listen to. She was a joy.
There is a lovely obituary in the FT by Edward Luce, and also in Sunday's weekend edition, our own proprietor Tyler Brulé has written a reflection which I do commend to our listeners. But Quentin, it's not easy summing up a person like that, but that kind of character you mentioned there, the proper old school hack's hack, what is the quality that sets them apart, do you think?
She was dead straight. She hated humbug and she hated pomposity. But she was also curious, constantly asking questions, constantly wanting to know the story behind the story. And I think that inquisitiveness and that directness were two very good things. She was also fantastically generous. She was a wonderful colleague for new journalists, for young journalists, for people who may have been a bit out of their depth or whatever. And she just was a great encouragement. She died at 65, which is far too young, and we'll miss her very much.
We will indeed, and there is more on Gwen Robinson coming up later this week on Monocle Radio, I believe, but we start tonight in Taiwan, where China is starting on Taiwan. Earlier today, and without warning in advance, as might have been polite, China embarked on large-scale military drills around Taiwan, and one does not require a long memory to recall another grumpy superpower staging what it claimed were military drills adjacent to a territory it regarded as a temporarily rogue province. By way of further extension of goodwill, these manoeuvres were accompanied by the release of a poster showing Chinese ships and jets circling Taiwan and the caption, "Sinister moves of Taiwan separatists courting disaster upon themselves," and a cartoon of Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te as some sort of parasite clasped in chopsticks. Isabel, first of all, very much not the first time China has behaved towards Taiwan in a somewhat intimidatory manner. Is this really any different from what we've seen previously?
Well, it reminds me of the response to the visit by Nancy Pelosi, which you may recall. She did a sort of valedictory tour, more at her own volition than by invitation from Taipei, and that precipitated something rather similar. I think this is what it seems to be a response to the Mr. Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, visiting Asia, visiting the Philippines and Japan, and talking about the need to, maintain a strong presence and all of that. But I think it's also testing the American administration, because honestly, nobody knows what Trump will finally do on China or Taiwan. And there's a great deal of nervousness in Taiwan about whether the US will stay committed to its defense, because one can imagine that, after a round of golf, Donald Trump decides that his best friend Xi Jinping and he can strike a useful deal. That could happen. So there is nervousness. Meanwhile, China's flexing its muscles. There was, in addition to the items you mentioned, the most extraordinary little cartoon film about the invasion, which had intercut with shots of lots of ships and planes taking off from aircraft carriers. It had sort of cartoon sequences from sort of kung fu movies of righteous PLA striking down more cartoon characters with, it was absolutely extraordinary. This produced by the PLA Eastern Command. It's not the sort of thing the MOD would put out. It's pretty extraordinary. And the Eastern Command is also undergoing another of those military purges. So there's a lot happening in the military at the moment.
I mean, it is the nightmare scenario, Quentin, but if you are regarding the current situation as the Chinese Communist Party might, is there any reason why they wouldn't right now be at least having the discussion about Taiwan along the lines of, well, if not now, then when?
I think absolutely so. And I think that the problem is that we're getting these extraordinary mixed messages coming out of Washington. There is no clarity. There is one day they must feel, well, this is the moment because we've got a president in America who believes that might is right, that actually whoever's got the power just get on with it and grab. And what's he planning to do in Panama or in Greenland? So from that point of view, and then you get Pete Hegseth going out and saying, hang on, we really back you, we support you forever and ever. So you get a very, very confused situation out of Washington. There is no clarity there. And if you're China, well, you will exploit whatever you can see. You're very tactical, but you'll push it.
I mean, Isabel, is what Quentin has just described there what used to be called strategic ambiguity, i.e. deliberately keep the Chinese guessing, and listeners, she's already creasing up, or is this just the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing?
Take a wild guess. Oh dear. Strategic ambiguity would be a welcome break, I can tell you, from this nonsense. Of course, there is another, from the Chinese perspective, there's another useful point about these exercises, which is that it exhausts the Taiwanese, and you're testing responses all the time. You're testing defense. If we do X, what do they put up against it? And that has gone on for quite a long time. I still tend to think, all other signs to the contrary, that the Chinese would prefer not to have to do a full-scale invasion because it's an uncertain matter.
Well,
they can't trust their own military, and they'd have to be fairly confident. There's a lot of unease internally at the moment. Now that could argue for the attraction of an external adventure. It could also argue for hang on a minute. Are you sure you can fight on two fronts? So let's see.
But just a final thought on this, Quentin. If it was a coherent policy/strategy, is strategic ambiguity actually the wise course? Because obviously if the combined Western world was to say to China, there is a red line down the Taiwan Strait, you put a foot across it and we're coming down there, there's no way China doesn't see that as a provocation.
Yeah, I see that, but I think that if you're going to have a policy of strategic ambiguity, you need to actually have a pretty clear idea in the back of your own mind where you want to end up. And that, I fear, is exactly what we don't have coming from the administration of Donald Trump.
Well, Taiwan is not the only jurisdiction which presently feels itself beleaguered by external threats. The European Union seems latterly to have understood the gravity of its own situation, menaced by Russia to the east, abandoned by the United States to the west. It has accordingly compiled a new strategy on internal security, which seeks to both strengthen and integrate the EU's various security agencies, the better to tackle such threats as organised crime and or hybrid warfare, having recognised that the former is increasingly employed as cover for the latter. Isabel, does this seem of a piece with the measures you were discussing at the top of the show, i.e., like perhaps one might argue, another banging of the stable door in the wake of a long-bolted horse?
Well, there's certainly, I do hear quite a lot of hooves around the landscape. However, I mean, when I think we should give credit to the European Union for at least, acting now in a positive direction. And a lot of the threats that it is currently addressing were not as salient or as important 10 years ago. So I'm not against people spending money on health and pensions and education and the other ways that most European countries chose to spend their dosh. However, the mood has definitely shifted. I was at a press conference at the European Commission the other day where they were giving advice to European citizens on how to prepare for an emergency. Have 72 hours of supplies to hand and all that kind of thing, which is not the sort of thing you're used to hearing from the European Commission, I have to say. And there are very robust discussions going on about how to organise security at every level in Europe. So from the how do we support member states who are on the front line in military terms, and how do we organise that? Not that the European Union is going to be a kind of defence organisation, but a role in coordination, for example, of defence industries and all the kind of back end stuff that Europe has neglected. That is very important. Lifting constraints on spending, Germany has, but so has Brussels. So the money should be available to beef up all manner of defence. And again, in the Commission, there's a great deal of anxiety about misinformation and disinformation and general sort of attacks on the European Union, partly from right-wing parties in Europe, but also organised. Russia clearly has an interest in weakening the European Union, and so does the American right. The Heritage Foundation also has a plan to disarticulate the European Union. So it's facing multiple and complicated threats, and I think that there is a great deal of hard thinking and hard talking going on, belatedly you might say, but nevertheless happening.
Another plank of this, Quentin, is proposing extending sanctions against Russia, as if there's still much we can find to sanction. Well, although actually attached to that, fun fact that I looked up earlier, last year EU imports of Russian energy surpassed EU aid to Ukraine. Yeah. So there clearly are still measures that could be taken. So my question is actually, at this point, why are we not just completely disbarring Russia? Why is just not every manner of contact with it? I've been asking this question since the Salisbury poisonings, mind you, but why are any Russian passport holders allowed travel to the EU? Why is there still a Russian embassy in London? Why are we still dealing with them at any level at all? Well,
that's certainly one proposal has just come up in the last few days, is saying, no Russians should be given visas to go into the entire Schengen area. So that would be very drastic. I think that the first thing was when the whole invasion of Ukraine happened and so on, that there was that panic moment. Oh God, how are we going to disengage from Russia because we're so dependent on the energy supplies? And inevitably that took time, but it is pretty
actually take as much time or cause as much difficulty as was anticipated, though.
Yes, although you did see in energy prices and so
True
on
enough.
that pain
went through the roof. Yeah,
and so undoubtedly, LNG had to be brought in from other sources and so on. So I think that was inevitable that it would take time, but I'm quite impressed at how far the European Union has got, and indeed how far Germany has got, although the German economy has slowed right down, so they've got problems. I think what we're talking about here, and the story that's just out now, this is about other aspects of security too, very much the internal aspects of security. So you're talking about, reinforcing and greatly strengthening Europol, the police, and actually using anti-terrorist legislation on cybersecurity and against the links between organised crime and Russia, for example, that this will be much tougher. Very challenging to actually go far down this route, because in a way what we're seeing is, are we allowing the Russians, if you like, to push us into being much less, much tougher on our own internal security than we would naturally be inclined to be, that our good liberal background is going to go out the window because we've really got to strengthen up on the cybersecurity and actually keeping the wolf from the door, because the danger is that if Europe is drifting to the right, you'll get some right-wing governments coming into power who might be delighted to have much tougher security legislation.
Well, a question I did want to put, Isabel, donning now my crazed libertarian headbanger hat, that these measures do, as such measures inevitably do, call for much greater access of law enforcement to personal data, as Quentin said, extending anti-terror powers to deal with domestic security. And it is not unimaginable that all these powers are awarded to governments which, a few years from now, are perhaps controlled by the AfD in Germany and the National Rally in France.
Well, that's certainly a possibility, but I think we ought to recognise that a right-wing government that is determined to curb civil liberties and undermine democratic norms can do so even now within the European Union. And I would look no further than Budapest for an example.
Well, on a related subject, listeners with powers of recollection stretching back further than 3 years may remember the stampede to Russia's exits by various foreign brands circa February 2022, as if invading Georgia, invading Ukraine the first time, invading Syria, wreaking various havoc across Africa and imprisoning and or murdering a variety of dissident domestic voices was not sufficient reason to ponder with whom you were doing business. The rush may shortly be in the opposite direction. Several corporations apparently pouring the ground in anticipation of sanctions being lifted as part of some sort of settlement in Ukraine. South Korean electronics concerns LG and Samsung are reportedly especially keen. On which note, Quentin, another fun fact, Russia's economy, for all Russia's vast heft, is actually not that much bigger than South Korea's. So why the hurry? Why does anybody want to get back into Russia?
I am reminded of days after I was in Moscow, which was back in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was people hammering on the door saying, this is very exciting, we're going to get into this perestroika world, we want to do joint ventures, let's get into Russia. And I remember going along to conferences as the FT correspondent and saying, watch out what you're doing, you will need bulletproof vests. This is a very dangerous place to do business. And I am looking at these people now hammering to get in. The Russian economy is not going to emerge from this war in a good state. It's a mess. It's poured money into defence spending, which won't be relevant if there is a peace, anything like to the same extent. And, it's got an inflation rate that's roaring through the roof, and it has got a real demographic problem too. So for all these reasons, it isn't really that attractive a market. And I'm really rather surprised. I think it's just because the Koreans, these big Korean giants like LG and Samsung, are quite worried that the Chinese are sewing up the market while they're not in it.
Well, I mean, that appears already to have happened, and there is an argument as to whether once that has happened, you ever get it back. But Isabel, on the subject of South Korea, would this not... This may be wishful thinking on my part. Would this not be particularly sensitive, given that, at barely one remove, South Korea and North Korea are kind of on opposite sides of this conflict? North Korea has, of course, sent troops to fight alongside Russia. South Korea has sold skiploads of weapons to Poland in particular, and other countries that are basically trying to keep themselves out of this conflict.
And you're absolutely right. And I find this item particularly puzzling because, for a start, it seems slightly premature to anticipate a lasting ceasefire, at least a ceasefire which would persuade, for example, the European Union to lift sanctions, and that would have to happen before sanctions were effectively lifted. There's certainly no mood to do that at present, and the Europeans are looking with rather a sceptical eye on the American efforts to wrangle Putin into a convincing deal. So I think that contemplating returning to Moscow is both premature and, for the reasons that Quentin has outlined, rather unwise.
I mean, Quentin, if we have arrived at a point at which the EU seems happier than previously to start chucking its weight around and realising that it actually is economically, diplomatically and militarily quite powerful when you stack it all up, would there be anything to the EU addressing such companies as LG and Samsung and saying, sure, go and do business in Russia, and then all across Europe, all of your televisions will cost not less than 20,000 euros each?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the right attitude. I think I would allow them to actually get their fingers burnt rather than try and burn them before they go in. I mean, they are saying, my reading of the story is, we're not going to do anything until sanctions are lifted. Mm. So they're not actually talking about trying to get in, as some American companies appear to be talking about. I mean, those American companies that are talking about rebuilding the gas pipeline and so on.
That is pretty extraordinary.
It really is very weird. I mean, it is actually startling, the sort of ignorance that one is seeing coming out of some of these parts of the world. They're just not doing their homework. And that's really worrying. I think it's a facet of the Trump administration that they don't seem to have much sense of history. But it's also others who are... I mean, there are so many pieces in the air at the moment, and there's so much uncertainty about direction. That's why we're seeing stock markets going down. That's why everybody's saying, oh my God, is there going to be a world trade war? That we're all caught, I think, in this situation. And even we wise journalists can't shed that much light.
None of it makes sense. You talk about reopening or repairing Nord Stream 2 to deliver gas to where exactly? Because in order for that to be worthwhile, Germany would have to, recreate its dependence on Russian gas, something that it spent a year getting off at some cost. And actually the mood in Germany, as far as energy security goes, is very much security is about renewables. It's about not being dependent on, capricious external markets where we can't control the cost and we can't control the supply. I can't see a German government, short of an AfD coming to power, ever agreeing to Nord Stream 2 being reopened.
One of the extraordinary damages that Putin has done to his country is that, if you remember the days of the Soviet Union exporting gas, they were the ultimate reliable
They were
supplier.
very reliable.
They never defaulted on a contract.
Yeah.
He has shown that you cannot trust Russia as a source of gas or oil. And that is devastating, I would have thought, for the future of Russia.
Well, since that's pretty much what they've got to sell, yes.
Right.
Well, now to exciting news for members, such as the presenter of this programme, of the admittedly extremely niche sub-clique of cinema enthusiasts whose favourite genre is the misbegotten rock and roll biopic. A veritable four-course feast awaits, circa 3 years from now. A quartet of films about the Beatles, each one focused on one of Messrs Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starr. The films will be directed by Sam Mendes, which does suggest a potentially upsetting degree of competence, and have today revealed their principal cast: Harris Hickinson, Paul Mescal, Barry Keoghan and Joseph Quinn as the Fab Four. First of all, without wishing to cast any overt aspersions, ungallant of that sort on the venerability of the rest of this panel, did either of you ever see them play live?
Actually, yes, I did.
Amazing. Where?
In Bradford.
You saw the Beatles live in Bradford?
They were very, very much at the beginning. And you couldn't hear them because as soon as they appeared, as soon as their first twang, the entire audience started to scream. So, but I saw them.
Fantastic. Can you recall anything that they actually played, did or said? Or
I couldn't hear it.
Were you partaking of that screaming?
No, No, I was never really given to screaming, but they played things like Love Me, the very early. I mean, this was very early.
This is
Love
fantastic.
Me Do. And, the early Beatles songs. They were all...
Well, they would have to be, because they actually jacked in live performance relatively early in the piece on the basis that they couldn't hear anything they were playing either.
It must have been quite annoying for them, yeah.
Well, clearly it was. Well, that is extraordinary, and one day I will ask to hear even more about that. But I will ask you first, Isabel, as someone who was there at the period which will be recreated, are you excited to see these films?
Well, I would definitely go and see the films.
All four?
Probably, yeah. I mean, they were a big part of my adolescence, the Beatles, like all those terrible adolescent parties that were dominated by Beatles. So you've got to go and relive it a bit, I did go to the Dylan movie after all.
See, I still haven't seen that yet, although one day I will. I mean, Quentin, my difficulty with the rock biopic is that I misspent a portion of my youth as an actual rock journalist, and therefore spent far too much time with musicians and on tour with musicians, and for that reason have found, I think, every rock biopic I have ever put myself through just absolutely risible. It's that thing when you see a fictional depiction of something you've actually done
like
yourself.
Journalism.
Like journalism, for example.
It just wasn't sordid enough.
You just sit there thinking, this is absolute bollocks. It says much about the milieu of rock and roll that the only film I've ever seen which depicts anything like the truth is, of course, This Is Spinal Tap, which is a satire.
Right, okay. I mean, I can understand that you would have that cynicism. Like Isabel, I went to see the Dylan film, which I much enjoyed. Having seen the wonderful two-part documentary by Martin Scorsese on Dylan, which is
tremendous,
Joan Baez and so on, all of them, and then went to see the film, very well acted by this Timothée Chalamet. But
well acted and well sung.
Yes, well sung, singing rather better than Dylan ever sang, if one might wish. But having said that, there's a dirty secret that Isabel and I have to share with you.
Go on.
We are not very familiar with any of the wonderful names of the actors who are supposed to be taking these big roles.
I wouldn't take that personally. I believe I would go so far as to say I had heard of one of them. But I couldn't really tell you why necessarily.
But I'm sure that they will do a great job. And I did enjoy the Dylan film for nostalgia. It really took me back. And I suddenly remembered those years in the mid-'60s. I sort of picked up on it in 63, 4, 5, I don't know. And when, we were in rebellion, it was anti-Vietnam, there was all that stuff. So this sort of turmoil in Europe-American relations was very much there. And you thought, hang on, maybe it isn't a total disaster where we are now. We've been a bit there before, although the difference then was we felt there was this younger generation in the US with whom we had an enormous amount in common. So I never saw the Beatles, but I did go to the Newport Folk Festival. But there, I didn't hear Bob Dylan. I heard Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Rescue. That was a wonderful moment.
That is, I do listen to that. In fact, since I saw the Dylan film, I did start listening to Guthrie again, and it is a wonderful performance.
I have seen Bob Dylan live, although obviously in recent years, and I think I've seen him 3 times, in which time... In those 3 times, I like to think I've had the complete Dylan experience, i.e. one, he didn't look like he knew where he was and didn't much care. One was just absolutely incomprehensible rubbish, and the other was just utterly transcendent and one of the most extraordinary things you could ever hope to witness on a stage, which I think is pretty much the Dylan gamut. But to return to the subject of the Beatles... is there anything about that band in particular, Isabel, that we do not imaginably know at this point? Is there really any fresh light that can be shed on this subject?
Probably not. And I have to say like Quentin, I enjoyed the Dylan film, and it was partly for a very superficial reason, that the actor playing Dylan looked like Dylan. And as I look at the photographs of these 4 very attractive young men, they don't really look like any of the characters they're going to play.
They can do wonders with makeup.
I'm sure they can do wonders with makeup, but being a superficial person, it's going to bother me.
Well, just finally then, because this is just my chance to stage one of the great after a few drinks rock journalist rows right here on the Monocle Daily. What's the best Beatles album? Quentin, you go first.
Well, I think it has to be Sgt. Pepper, but maybe I'm too obvious.
I mean, that's barely less obvious than saying the best of the Beatles. But okay, I mean, there's a case to be made for Sgt. Pepper. I'm not massively taken with it myself. Isabel, which one?
I'm with Quentin on this one.
Two for Sgt. Pepper.
So what are you
vote you down?
Just me with Revolver.
Oh, right.
Okay.
That is my pick. Largely, possibly because it does feature somewhat in the mythology of rock journalism. I don't know how true this is. Legend insists that at some point either Melody Maker, for which I used to work, NME, not so much, adorned a review of a substandard Lennon or McCartney solo album, because it works with either, with the headline "And Your Bird Can't Sing." Isabel Hilton and Quentin Peel, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, it is time, and this is about to seem like an incredibly witty introduction to this item. Please keep the motif time in mind, to head to Geneva and the Watches and Wonders wingding commemorating the horological heritage of the Swiss city. Time, watches, you see what I did there. On reflection, may not have been worth it. But I'm joined from Geneva by Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi. Natalie, first of all, introduce to our listeners, if you would, Watches and Wonders. What goes on at it?
So it is, like you said, one of the biggest horological fairs. And I think about it as kind of like the Olympics of the watch industry. Everyone comes together, from buyers, collectors, of course, press, to meet Swiss watch brands, but increasingly also a lot of international watch brands are coming here. And this is the one time of the year where everyone gets together and you get to discover the novelties that these brands are presenting for the year. People are writing about them, they're placing orders, and it's just a big kind of convention. And of course, in the evenings, you get plenty of opportunities for cocktails and socializing as well, which is really fun.
Well, now that you've described it like that, it does seem pretty much the dictionary definition of the sort of thing that Monocle would go to. But that aside, why is Monocle specifically there?
Yeah, aside from the great parties, we are there to discover the new collections. For us, it's a moment to meet the brands that we're often writing about, and to kind of handpick. We look at everything that they're presenting, and we handpick the pieces that then make it onto the pages of the magazine. We spot trends. We kind of understand what's going on in the market. And what's most interesting for me especially is it's an opportunity to also do a lot of interviews, meet the CEOs, the creative directors of these brands, and kind of quiz them about the houses that they're working on, but also just more generally take the temperature of the watch market.
And how is the watch market holding up? Because it now faces, and I guess has done for a few decades now, a challenge which it once did not, which is that basically everybody has a thing in their pocket that tells them the time. A watch has by definition pretty much become a luxury item.
Exactly, I think, and this has been really a big topic of conversation the whole day since I've arrived here and started doing interviews and speaking to people. I think watchmakers are really aware of this, and now they are just getting very creative about ways of telling time, and they see it as something a lot more poetic. Hermes, for example, the product that they're focusing on this year has this concept of suspended time. So you can actually press a button and the watch stops working. And it's this idea of kind of stopping time, taking time for yourself. Also, watches can be, they've become much smaller. They're hidden inside pendants, inside bracelets. So like you say, it's a luxury item, it's an accessory. But to be fair, even if the functional side of it is not as important, this hasn't stopped collectors from buying into watches, and demand has been higher than ever in recent years.
Well, yeah, because for all the interest in tradition and in innovation, rather, and trying to find something new to do with the watch. There is presumably an awareness that when people buy a Swiss watch, they like to think they are buying into a heritage or a tradition or something which has been fairly reliably unchanging for centuries.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these designs that we're seeing have been around since the 1920s, 1930s. Van Cleef has just been kind of highlighting one of their beautiful Art Deco pieces from the 30s, and it's just very small refinements every season. So when you're buying into a watch, you know that it's timeless and it's a piece of design that will only increase in value over time. So people see these pieces as investment, and it's also a way for them to just invest in craft and be creative.
The event is open to the public this weekend, I believe. So with that in mind, have you seen anything in particular that has tempted you to try and walk back out of there wearing it and claim to the security guards that you were wearing it when you arrived?
I'm always tempted, Andrew, but sadly the security is too tight here. But yeah, there's plenty to discover. I mean, I mentioned the 1930s Art Deco pieces from Van Cleef. I think Hermes has some beautiful kind of modern icons because they're new to the world of horology, but they've really kind of established themselves recently. I love the Cat watch, which is kind of like a sportier day style. And I mean, if you have 8 million euros to spare, there's also these beautiful one-of-a-kind timepieces by Van Cleef and Arpels that you can custom order. So there's something for everyone, really. Just depends on your budget.
Natalie Theodosi at Watches and Wonders in Geneva, thank you for joining us. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Isabel, Hilton and Quentin Peel. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.